Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book God's Not Dead by Rice Broocks. In this video, I will be covering chapter 9 of the book, which is titled The Grace Effect. So let's get started, shall we? Broocks begins the chapter by describing the world of 2,000 years ago, the world into which Jesus would have been born and lived. Life was cheap, Broocks says. Children were fodder for pagan sacrifice. Women were regarded as livestock, and a quarter of the population lived as slaves. And that wasn't all. Quote, 4 successive empires had taken their turns dominating the human race: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. All 4 boasted emperors who acted as gods, brutally conquered all opposition, and used the full force of their strength to keep the world under their thumb. The might of their empire had no equals and few challengers until they were conquered by the next empire. Well, first, the practice of child sacrifice in Europe and the Middle East is a subject for debate among historians. Some believe that the Carthaginians practiced ritual sacrifice, while others believe that accounts of child sacrifice in Carthage were actually exaggerated or possibly even invented entirely by the Romans in order to demonize their enemies after the city of Carthage had been conquered. Either way, whether the Carthaginians practiced child sacrifice or not, child sacrifice was not widespread throughout the Greco-Roman world, as Broocks is perhaps implying that it was. I'm just guessing here, but Brooks's source for the practice of child sacrifice seems to be the Bible, and indeed it is from the Bible that we learn that child sacrifice is a barbaric and abhorrent practice, unless ordered by Yahweh. Second, do you notice how tiny the world is? Look at the broad terms Broocks employs. The Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires dominated the human race. They kept the world under their thumbs. Their empires had no equals. He refers to the region of the Mediterranean and the Middle East as though it were the entire world, and as though the people who lived there were the entire human population. Unlike the original authors of the Bible, Broocks knows better, presumably. But he needs us, as we read this book and as we consider the occurrences depicted in the Bible, to think of the region where the events depicted in the Bible supposedly took place as the world, or at least as the only important part of the world, because he's about to position Jesus as the humble underdog who somehow toppled the mighty Roman Empire which ruled the world. Even if we accept Brooks's grossly distorted, church-approved, Jesus defeated Caesar with the power of God's love version of history, the success of the Christian church in the first millennium AD is a regional phenomenon at best. The mighty, divinely inspired, world-changing movement of Christ and his followers was unknown and irrelevant to people living in East Asia, or Central and Southern Africa, or Australia, or the Americas for 1,000 years. But whatever. Broocks doesn't care about those other parts of the world. He cares about the parts that his religion considers important, the part over which Jesus Christ and those who loved him and followed his teachings were eventually able to gain influence and control. Such a thing was only possible by God's grace, Broocks says, and that grace, it's amazing. Quote, that's why grace is often referred to as amazing. It doesn't just mean we are forgiven by God for our wrongdoing, but we are empowered to overcome the human tendency to be evil. So if it's grace that empowers us to overcome the tendency to be evil, what is it that empowers us to overcome the equally human tendency to be good? Or when our religions encourage us to embrace the more tribal side of our nature and to mistrust outsiders and demonize those who don't practice our religion or who we define as different in some way, is that just another form of grace? Actually, I misspoke just now. See, it seems that grace is not a matter of religion. According to Broocks, religious groups can be responsible for atrocities and all sorts of evil, but no one truly touched by God's grace would ever do such things. Check. As an example of someone who confused grace with religion, Brooks presents Christopher Hitchens. Brooks acknowledges that Hitchens was a formidable debater on the topic of religion, but, quote, Hitchens' undefeated streak came to a screeching halt when he met William Lane Craig at Biola University in 2009. Craig may be the most formidable Christian apologist of our day. Atheist magazines admitted, quote, Craig spanked Hitchens like a foolish child. Victory and defeat in a debate is a matter of opinion. I've watched the 2009 Biola debate a few times over the years, and while I don't think it's the best debate that Hitchens ever had, I have never come away from it the least bit impressed by Craig. And by the way, the atheist magazines that supposedly admitted Craig's superiority are actually a single blog called Common Sense Atheism, written by Luke Muehlhauser, who is an atheist, but who also has an uncommonly high opinion of Craig as a debater and seemingly a rather low opinion of Hitchens in general. Notice how Brooks reintroduces Craig yet again in that quote, as if, despite having mentioned him prominently in multiple chapters already, Brooks still expects we'll have no idea who the fuck he's talking about. And by the way, if Craig truly is the most formidable Christian apologist of our day, that doesn't say much for Christian apologetics. Craig is a buffoon. Brooks moves from Craig to another debate opponent of Christopher Hitchens. That would be Larry Taunton, who has argued that God's grace has had a significant positive impact on the world. Brooks agrees, of course. Remember, good stuff that can be somehow attributed to Christianity is the result of God's grace. Bad stuff that can be attributed to religion is the result of humans screwing things up. Now, one last quote from Brooks's consideration of Hitchens, because it provides me with a lovely segue for the next section of the chapter. Brooks complains about how negatively Hitchens portrayed religion. He accuses Hitchens of painting a distorted and unfair picture. He says, quote, to take all the worst parts of anything deemed religious and patch it together as reality is the tactic of a dirty politician, not someone attempting a serious historical commentary. Well, I'm glad to know that Brooks feels this way. Or does he only feel this way when people are attacking his religion? Here's another quote from a few pages later. Quote, make no mistake, regardless of the vast number of people claiming a belief in God and the enormous variety of religious expressions, the skeptic's aim is at the Christian faith. It's common to hear things like, all Christians are hypocrites. Well, it's true that some atheists/skeptics do frequently accuse Christians of hypocrisy and malign their character in other ways. But how is what Brooks is doing here any different than what he complains about Christopher Hitchens doing? If Christopher Hitchens was strawmanning religion by pointing out the violence, oppression, and persecution committed by the church, and I don't think he was, by the way, then surely Brooks is strawmanning critics of religion by choosing to address only the most belligerent among us. And this isn't the first time Brooks has strawmanned critics of Christianity. Remember how he held up for ridicule the college student who proposed that the Bible had been written by aliens in the previous chapter. Brooks says that critics of religion are correct to point out the failures of Christianity. Just believing in God and knowing right from wrong is not enough. You need grace. Quote, but grace is the result of God's Spirit acting on the human heart and empowering us to overcome evil. There are millions of real believers who are serving God faithfully, as well as serving their fellow men through acts of kindness, integrity, and service. Real believers. Did you catch that? God's grace not only helps us to treat our fellow humans with kindness, it allows us to comprehend the depth of our own indefensible depravity. Brooks references the great hymn Amazing Grace, and specifically the line that saved a wretch like me. He says that it was by God's grace that the author of those lyrics, former slave trader John Newton, came to understand his sins. God Brooks says, is a God not only of love, but of judgment. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, one requires the other. Critics of Christianity often accuse the God of the Bible of being harsh and cruel, but those same critics will cry out for the justice that only he can provide. Quote, if God did not judge evil, then he wouldn't be truly loving. Think of TV shows such as The People's Court and Divorce Court, where we witness the constant cry of men and women for someone to set the record straight and give them justice. When a crime of any kind is committed, we long for justice. The only being in the universe who is wise enough to judge rightly and truly and knows the whole story is God. I agree that we long for justice. It's just that I and Brooks's God disagree on what justice means. I think it's part of our moral sensibilities to want to see people treated fairly, to see good rewarded and evil punished. But on shows like People's Court, I'm more of a Judge Judy guy myself, or indeed in the judicial system, when punishments are handed down, there is a system in place to help ensure that the punishment is proportionate to the crime. If a court found someone guilty of petty theft and sentenced them to be executed, that would strike most of us as unfair. But ultimately, God has only one punishment, to which everyone who commits even the most minor infraction of his rules is sentenced. Eternity in hell. This is a default sentence that, according to Christians, you have to buy your way out of using the saving blood of Jesus. An infinite punishment for a finite crime. This alone, to me, throws the question of justice out the window. How can it be just for an all-powerful being to impose an unlimited penalty on a limited, comparatively powerless being? Brooks isn't just defending the notion that a loving and omnipotent God would send people to hell. He's also defending the acts of genocide God is depicted committing or ordering others to commit in the Old Testament. A just God must punish evil, even when it is committed by an entire nation. And, quote, history records how debauched and depraved were the nations he ordered destroyed. The murder and disregard for human life through their detestable practices was only a part of how perverse they had become. When God acted in judgment, he was like a surgeon amputating a cancerous limb to save the entire body. These nations needed to be stopped, as the Nazis of World War II did. Well, history records nothing of the nations God supposedly destroyed, nor of the original population of the earth, which he supposedly drowned in a quite non-surgical global flood. Brooks is talking about Bible stories, which he continues to pathetically put forward as history. And by the way, I can't help but notice from the actual history that I have studied that it was not God who stopped the Nazis, but other nations who joined forces against them. And the Nazis were not stopped by killing every single citizen of their nation, or every single Nazi, for that matter. Human justice may be limited, imperfect, and occasionally very messy, but it is far, far, far more efficient, humane, and moral than the justice meted out by God in the pages of the Bible, and thankfully nowhere else. By the way, if you still think that God's justice is too harsh, Brooks would like to remind you that the law of God provided that sacrifices could be made to avoid the harshest punishments. Well, there, see? You think God's punishment for your crime is so harsh? Well, there's probably an innocent creature that you can ritually murder to avoid having to take that punishment yourself. And you dare to accuse God of being some kind of vicious barbarian. Anyway, back to God's grace. See, understanding the seriousness of our own crimes against God allows us to more fully appreciate how amazing it is that he doesn't just murder every last fucking one of us. Brooks reminds us that none of us deserves to go to heaven. It's only by God's grace, in the form of the sacrifice of Christ, that any of us are able to avoid eternal damnation. It's important that we understand just how big of a solid God is doing us with the whole grace thing. This is a common theme, not just in Christian apologetics, but in many forms of Christianity itself. And it's the idea that God, the infinite and all-powerful maker and sustainer of the universe, needs us, his pitiful creations, his wayward children, to recognize and acknowledge what a swell guy he is for allowing some of us to exist in a state of something other than eternal anguish. God's grace operates not merely on the level of individuals, but also on the level of entire societies, and this is called common grace. Brooks lists 10 positive things about civilization today that are the result of common grace. First, there is the dignity of life. In the ancient world, Brooks says, life was valued less than it is today. This devaluation of life is the logical result of a naturalistic worldview that denies God as the designer and author of life. Faith in God is what attaches a premium to life. The pre-Christian world was not dominated by atheists, contrary to what Brooks seems to be suggesting here. And there is a huge difference between an atheist and a pagan. Few ancient people had a purely naturalistic concept of life. Also, though concepts of human rights and the inherent value of life have evolved significantly, and for the better, I would say, in the last few thousand years, I don't think it's fair to say ancient people placed no value on human life. Brooks's view of non-Jewish / pre-Christian people as child-sacrificing savages seems based mostly on the Bible, which is a decidedly biased source. Second, protection of children. Until Jesus came along to speak up for them, children were the most vulnerable group of people there were. Brooks says, quote, abortion was normal 2,000 years ago. The practices of the Greco-Roman world made killing the unborn or discarding newborns as common as discarding a bruised melon at the market. The grace of God, released through the influence of his people on the culture, made an enormous impact in that area. Well, I hate to break it to Brooks, but abortion is normal today. And as long as it's done safely, by choice, and under the care of a doctor, many of us are totally fine with that. There are even Christians who accept that abortion being legal is a good thing. Now, Brooks might not consider them to be true Christians, but I'm pretty sure they don't need his fucking permission. Third, elevation of women. Brooks calls Jesus an unquestioned champion of women's rights and says he imparted to them the dignity and value they deserved. This is bullshit. After proposing Jesus as the world's first feminist, Brooks acknowledges that oppression and underrepresentation of women is still a major problem in most of the world today, including the Christian parts. He'd like to pretend that it's only the Muslims or those godless commies in China who mistreat women, but the truth is Christianity did women no favors 2,000 years ago, nor did it promote equality and empowerment of women prior to the secular Enlightenment, which began around 300 years ago, nor is much of it all that nuts about pushing for women's rights today. It is opportunistic and dishonest to claim that Christianity is somehow better than other religions, or that Christian-dominated cultures are superior to non-Christian cultures when it comes to women's issues. The most powerful force opposing the equality of women today, in our secular culture, is religion, including Christianity. In the Western world, it is Christianity that continues to promote traditional gender roles that place women in subservience to their husbands, that tell women that their proper places are as wives and mothers and nothing more, that seek to rob women of their right to control whether or not they become or remain pregnant. I have a lot more to say about this, but I'll wait until I get to the end of the top 10 list because it kind of applies to the whole thing. Fourth, abolition of slavery. It was committed followers of Christ who led the struggle to end slavery, Brooks says. Slavery, I should say. Brooks maybe would have been tolerated widely in the ancient world, but he wasn't there at the time. Slavery was widely tolerated, he says, in the ancient world, as it was tolerated in the Christian world for over a millennia. Strange how it took most Christians until the Age of Enlightenment to realize that allowing rich people to own poor people was kind of shitty. Sure seems like if the abolition of slavery was the result of God's grace, God would have gotten around to it a little sooner. Perhaps he might even have seen fit to spare a few words to unambiguously condemn it in his flawless, divinely inspired scripture. Fifth, education. Christians are taught to glorify God with all their minds. Plus, accepting that God is the creator of the universe compels us to learn more about that creation. And how are we supposed to read the Bible unless we can read? So Christianity inspires literacy. People were educated prior to the advent of Christianity. And the ancient Israelites, to whom God supposedly decided to reveal himself, were not nearly as literate and sophisticated at the time as, say, the Chinese, about whom God inspired the authors of the Bible to write not a single fucking word. Also, as with the rights of women, the church has historically been a powerful and destructive force against education. It's one thing to say that reading the Bible promotes literacy and appreciating God's creation encourages love of science, but that ignores practically the entirety of church history, where ideas that were deemed contrary to church teaching were banned and promoters of those ideas were silenced and often severely punished. And today, once again, the most formidable force against education in the world is religion. The efforts to omit the difficult, unflattering bits from American history classes, or to introduce the Judeo-Christian creation myth into science classes are explicitly and entirely religious in nature, and that's just the nature of the issue in this country. 6. Charity. Jesus taught that it is better to give than to receive, and Christians tend to give more to charity than atheists. Brooks quotes Larry Taunton, who cites a poll by the Barna Group that found the average evangelical gave 10 times as much to nonprofits as the average atheist. Of note about that study, the Barna Group is a marketing firm whose clients are mostly Christian ministries, and the poll counted churches as nonprofits. So is it God's grace that causes Christians to be more generous? Or is it the fact that they attend churches that ask them for money in the name of God on a weekly basis? 7th, care for the sick. Jesus sent his disciples out into the world to heal the sick, and it was in following their example that Christians cared for the sick and infirm in their churches, which eventually led to the creation of hospitals. Brooks specifically cites the example of Mother Teresa, who selflessly devoted her life to serving the poorest of the poor. Mother Teresa served those poor, sick people by building warehouses in which they could die in agony without proper medical care or pain relief. She believed physical suffering brought people closer to God. If I were a Christian, I would be very, very reluctant to tout the example of Mother Teresa when talking about how religion encourages people to care for the sick. 8th, ethnic unity. Naturalism and evolution promote racism, while the Bible teaches that we are all of one blood. Plus, there's the story of the Good Samaritan, the most famous parable of Jesus, where a member of a despised ethnicity stops to help a person in need. Well, properly understood, evolution, and specifically the concept of common descent, is the most powerful argument against racism that there could possibly be, because it offers objective scientific evidence that all people are related to each other and to all other forms of life on this planet. Physically, genetically, for real. It is the most powerful and unifying fact about life on Earth, and to suggest otherwise is ignorant and repugnant, especially when the alternative being offered is one particular interpretation of one religion. Also, I have nothing against the parable of the Good Samaritan. I agree with Brooks that it does carry a message of tolerance and inclusion. It's just a shame, once again, that it seems to have taken most Christians 1 millennium and over a half of another one to get that message, while Brooks seems to consider that message to be an undeniable aspect of his faith. One more thing on the subject of Christianity and God's grace and racial acceptance, ethnic unity. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus uses a racial slur. He tells a Greek woman who asks him to deliver her daughter from demonic possession that he has come to feed the children, by which he means the Israelites, and not the dogs, by which he means people like her, the Gentiles. Now, Jesus is corrected by this woman that he has just denigrated. She tells him that even the dogs get to eat scraps from the table, and to his credit, Jesus accepts the correction and he heals this woman's child. Now, it seems that even Jesus himself, according to the scriptures written by the people who worshipped him, needed to be educated on the value of racial tolerance. So I'm not sure where Brooks gets off being so cocky about his church's record on the subject. Ninth, liberty and freedom. It was the Bible that taught that leaders, even kings, were subjected to a higher law than their own. Liberty, Brooks says, is a God-given idea. Yes, the liberty to serve God forever and to go to hell if we don't like it. How many tyrants in history have claimed to borrow their authority from Brooks's God? How many have been aided in their tyranny by the church? And how could there be a greater tyrant than Brooks's God himself? 10th, the strong serving the weak. Christianity teaches that the poor and the weak are to be protected. This is in contrast to the naturalistic worldview, which says that only the strong are worthy to survive, and that we are only animals competing with each other. To me, the noblest and most beautiful verse of the entire Bible is Matthew 25:40, which reads, "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." The notion that we should extend our hands to those who are struggling, and that we should be judged by how we treat the poorest among us, is the essence of morality and humanity. It is beautifully expressed in the King James Bible, but it is not original to the Bible, nor must we depend on the Bible to derive that principle. Here, as in every other item on this list, Brooks is giving credit to Christianity, or to God's grace, if you like, that it doesn't deserve. With this, and the value of life, and the rights of women and children, and the abolition of slavery, and the promotion of education, and all the rest of these supposed positive results of grace, Brooks is talking about causes for which the church did virtually nothing for over 1,000 years, which were only able to gain real traction and drive significant change after the ideals of the secular Enlightenment took root. Brooks wants us to believe that these notions of human rights and charity come from his religion, but it was not until people realized that these concepts could be derived without relying on any supposed revelation from God, and that they applied to all people, regardless of what religion they professed, that the world truly began to change. Slavery was abolished, human rights were valued, women began to be elevated, the welfare of the sick and the poor became matters for real concern. None of it happened while the church was setting the agenda. All of it came after people realized that they didn't need to rely on the church to tell them how they should govern themselves or how they should treat each other. But here's where the dishonesty of Brooks's argument comes into play again. Remember, he credits the good stuff to God's grace and the bad stuff to humans making mistakes and failing to live up to the ideals of Christ. It's the true believers who were responsible for the positive stuff. The Christians who worked so tirelessly for so long to oppose all that positive stuff, well, they just don't count because they were doing it wrong. And no true Christian It's easy to make the case that God's grace has had a positive effect on history if you define your terms such that no other conclusion is possible. But that's not a sign of a strong argument. Honest people don't do that. Intelligent, thoughtful people don't do that. Cowards, liars, and ignoramuses do that. If Rice Broocks objects to being described in those terms, then he should start conducting himself otherwise. But he's only got one chapter left in which to do it, and I am not optimistic about his chances. That's it for Chapter 9. In the next video in this series, I will finish the book by looking at Chapter 10, titled Living Proof, and also the conclusion of the book, which is titled Seeking God. And then I'm done. That's it. This series is almost over. I'm so close to the end, I can taste it! So, thank you guys, as always, for watching this. I am so thrilled beyond expression that this is of interest to you, that you find some use for this. Please leave a comment on this video. Tell me what you agree with. Tell me what you disagree with. Tell me what I got right. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me what I could have done better. Any comment from you is of great interest to me. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video to wrap up the book.